Okay, let me call this work session into order and have Mr. Marty Smith introduce everyone at the table.
Good evening, everyone. We're happy to be here this evening to present the goal report for Goal 4. And we have several folks at the table with us. We have Jessica Gillis, who is our Special Projects Administrator in Design and Construction. We have Lady Haruda, who is our Director for the Office of Research and Strategic Improvement. We have Tom Baccarella with us, who is our Director for the Office of Safety and Security. And of course, we have Lee Burden, who's our Assistant Superintendent for Financial Services. And if you remember from our school board, or from the regular school board meeting, Ms. Burden, she presented our Goal 4 report. Mr. Moon, thank you for your email to the board asking for questions. We received no questions from the board prior to the meeting this evening. Mr. Moon also shared that we would not be representing the information from the actual report. So we are here to answer any questions that the board might have about the Goal 4 Resource Stewardship Report. And we have those folks around the table who might be able to answer those questions. So with that, I turn it back to you, Mr. Moon.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. McLachlan.
Yes, I have just a process question. I appreciate when we're trying to be as efficient with our time as possible, but the public didn't watch our Thursday business meeting, and now here we are doing a work session. So is there any way to just at high level touch on just a little bit about what the board's going to be discussing? I mean, we've got a whole PowerPoint presentation sitting in front of us, and I would have hoped we'd at least just touch on the highlights of what this discussion is. So you don't have to go through the whole PowerPoint, but something to tee it up.
Mr. Smith, if you could spend just 2-3 minutes, just quickly.
Good evening. So this report represents the Goal 4 Resource Stewardship that we presented to the school board on the 10th at the regular school board meeting, and the work sessions tonight, and approval will occur or acceptance of the report will occur on November the 7th at the regular school board meeting. The first page basically shows the terms overview. At this point, I think you all are pretty familiar with that. And then the aspirations of resource stewardship, which include maintaining a cost per pupil plus or minus $1,000 of the average cost per pupil of the Washington Area Boards of Education guide average, and we met that target. Ensuring that funds will be allocated using the strategic decision-making cycle. We progressed towards that target. Ensuring that the schools have adequate student classroom space, eliminating trailers. We made progress toward that target as well. And finally, that we'll maintain schools that all students, families, and staff consider safe. And we also made progress toward that target. As far as the cost per pupil goes, again, we are plus or minus 1,000. Compared to the WABE average. Our cost per pupil is $15,293, and $15,103 is the Washington Area Board's average. So we are plus $190 to that average, so well within the $1,000 range that we're looking for. As far as the second aspiration, all spending will be allocated using the strategic decision-making cycle. As you all know, we made progress towards that by aligning the budget using that SDMC cycle beginning in fiscal 20 that was presented in January of 19. We allocated the budget by those 4 goal areas as well as the increases to the budget. And again, with the 4 goal areas being student success, caring culture, premier workforce, and resource stewardship. The actions that we took to do that was basically the Financial Services Department working closely with the Office of Research and Strategic Improvement to align the budget to those 4 goal areas. The next steps on that are to align the funding to the 8 prioritized areas, and we are on track to do that. The third aspiration is all schools will have adequate classroom space for students, eliminating the need for trailers. We made progress towards reducing the number of trailers or temporary classrooms by removing a net of 69, or 9%, in fiscal 19. Most of the removals are attributed to school renovations. An additional 32 were removed due to consultation with schools for better use of their space, and the reduction was offset by an addition of 23 temporary classrooms through an annual facilities review. We've taken a lot of actions to provide adequate classroom space. Again, renovation, conducting annual programs, capacity and facility reviews, consultation with principals for efficient and appropriate use of space, and then, of course, we continually monitor the condition of temporary classrooms to ensure quality. We believe that the current actions taken to reduce temporary classrooms don't place us in a trajectory to reach our target without accelerating trailer removal and/or reducing the need for additional space. So our next steps are plans to examine our current approach and determine what else is needed to accelerate those programs. The fourth aspiration is that we will maintain schools that all students, family, and staff consider safe. We made progress there. The students and staff reported perceptions of safety that were higher than at baseline. Family perceptions of safety were collected for the first time and showed even higher perceived levels of safety than reported by students and staff. And all of this data came from the state climate survey for students and staff and the family engagement survey for families. The action taken for this aspiration, including safety and security training. Recall that we added 8 additional technical positions to do the tabletop training exercises and other trainings. We also replaced classroom locks, enhanced mental health support. A total of $4.2 million was approved by this board to hiring those 8 staff members, and that cost about $1.1 million, with $500,000 towards classroom locks and $2.6 million for an additional 9 psychologists and 9 social workers to provide greater mental health support at 19 middle schools. We're on track to meet the 2020 target with students. We'll need to make some gains in staff perceptions of safety to meet our target levels. And then there are budget considerations. The strategic decision-making cycle process could require more staff, more resources to add that workload to the existing workload. Adequate classroom space will require additional facilities and transportation, services staff to support capacity and facility reviews, and safety, again, funding for mental health professionals will need to be continued, and then the Office of Safety and Security may be needed. More positions may be needed there for oversight of school-based safety. And then the final considerations regarding the aspirations is we may need to repurpose current funds to support strategic priorities and keep the CPP within the target range. A more flexible approach to budgeting may be needed for the strategic decision-making. We're going to need to find innovative ways to balance the need for additional space against the desire to reduce those temporary classrooms. And then we'll need to understand the sources of safety concerns by students, parents, and staff. And again, approval or acceptance of the report should occur at the November 7th school board meeting.
Thank you. I have Karen Corbett-Sanders to be followed by Delia Perchik. Anybody else? Mrs. Strauss? Chairman Sanders, Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Burden, for your brief overview of the whole report. The report's excellent. I have a couple of questions. I know that we've talked for now 4 years about the importance of aligning our budget with our strategic plan. We made some progress last year with new monies. Would like to know where we're at in preparing our budget for next year to align it with align existing monies to the strategic plan. That's my first question. My second question is really about those pesky trailers and concerns that they just, we're not getting rid of them quick enough, and concerns that the last conversation we had about pre-K could actually put increased pressure on capacity for our buildings. And so I would like to know from you if you've, and I've asked this in the past, if we've done an estimate of what the impact of adding pre-K classrooms at the same level that we did when we had all-day K implemented, what would that do to our planning to get rid of our trailers? On the discussion regarding the, and also would like to see that in light of a projection of capacity needs in light of getting our math and science classrooms at the middle and high school at a lower level to 24 or 25. My last area is when we go to your discussion about safety and security, and I know I'm echoing the concerns that we need to look at this also increasingly at lower ages, and so are you building into the budget more mental health supports for our elementary school students, because we know that they're dealing with more stress? I do fully support your recommendation of having a position to support monitoring of social media, because we know, at least in the recent past, that that's been a very important role for our security folks to be doing. And lastly, what additional building modifications do you think are necessary to address safety and security concerns, not only in our classrooms and in our schools, but more important, or not more importantly, but equally important, is the safety and security concerns of our staff in the more traditional office buildings?
So we have quite a few questions there. I think that we'll be able to answer as many as we can this evening, and the rest we can answer with next steps. But Ms. Haruta can begin with where we are with the budgeting process.
So for the fiscal 21 budget, we are currently going to be dividing up the changes to the budget from last year into the 8 different aspirations that guide the work for the strategic plan. So that's what we're doing for fiscal 21. Moving forward during the year, we're also going to be figuring out exactly what is used for the strategic initiatives that we're doing. So we've already started a process to allow us to be able to clearly identify that as well. And so that will also be available moving forward, which is why we say we're well on our way to being able to divide everything up into the 8 aspirations, not just the 4 goals that started.
So essentially, you're taking last year's, which we already allocated, and you're taking all new monies this year and having it allocated. I still have an ask, which has been out there now for 3.5 years, of the existing monies and how we allocate it. And last year, that was supposed to have been a priority for this year. So if I could please have a timeline of when you expect that to be done, I would appreciate it, because at this point, it's not any real reflection on prior years. It's just last year, which we already did, and this year. And last year, you promised that we were going to reflect backwards on existing monies.
Yes, so we will be able to do it for, so some of the work is specific just to the 8, and so for that, we will have that available. And then there's other work that happens in the school system that's not specifically directed towards the 8 parts of the strategic plan, and so that would be also indicated but broken down just into the 4. So we will have, I believe, what you're asking for, dividing up everything into the 8 that exists for the 8, as well as everything that is not part of the strategic plan and just helps with the functioning of the school system, divided into the 4.
And so that should be the entire budget for this upcoming budget process. It will be prepared for the board, and they will have that for review. Yes, and looking at the pressures I've got here, where trailers what is the impact of adding those pre-K classrooms? One thing that we're doing now, in thinking about the last presentation that we had, I know I've been working with Joe Mondoro, and we're starting to pull together a work group to think about the additional pressures that additional pre-K might place on the system, both the county and the school system. We've yet to have our first meeting. I know that it's on the books here this coming month, but we do want to have that first blush discussion about what some of those pressures might be. And so once we get more information that comes out of that work group, we will certainly bring that back for the board to get a better understanding of what those pressures are and where we might see some opportunities for shared services, shared building space, and then what that means for us with regard to CIP and other new construction. And then, so Tom, there's a question about safety and security. I know that there was a mention about what we're doing with our social media presence, and of course, wanting to know more about those mental health supports and what that might look like for our budgeting process. I think Ms. Johnson is still with us. Oh, no, Ms. Johnson is not with us. I know that we're in the process now of looking at those department requests. Actually, this coming 4th of November, we're going to look at all those department requests. Built into that are additional mental health supports, and so I think that you'll see something coming forward in the superintendent's budget around additional supports, both instructionally and in student services for mental health. And I know that Tom can answer more of the questions around safety and security and what some of those building modifications might look like for both schools and central office.
Thank you. So on that point, following on Mr. Smith regarding how we move forward with additional building, brick and mortar is what I interpreted your question to be. So we were under budget with the lock project. We've moved forward this year in a continuing effort. We've moved on to libraries and cafes. We'll be installing within this fiscal year state-of-the-art, so to speak, locks that are lever indicated for cafes, and we've already made those installations in some of our libraries. This past year, as a result of the positions that were authorized by the school board, we did a review of every library in the county schools, as well as conducted training for librarians. That also went along with the installation of these locks to secure people within these open spaces. I think we need to continue to take a look at locks as we move forward. It's a big ask. You know, the initial $1 million that was provided went towards those cylinder-style locks that couldn't lock from the inside. They were just open-turn locks. I think we need to look at that moving forward. We're looking at things involving the vision panels of our classrooms, securing those, and staffing is always a part of security. So I want to just take a step back on the social media question that you asked. That position, the coordinator that was authorized by the school board, was hired last week. The social media analyst position, that backfill, is in process right now. We've already looked at the software. We went to a convention this summer and looked at software and ways to, with our partners, implement this program of open source data mining and social media monitoring.
And I can also share that I've asked Mr. Vaccarell and his team to look at our office buildings, Gatehouse and other office buildings with regard to safety and security. We have a review of this building, and we have a review of Willow Oaks, and are looking at other office buildings and thinking about recommendations for the superintendent on how we might improve the safety and security of these buildings. When we think about the members of the public who have access to the building, the floors they have access to, and how we might sort of change that flow of access to particular parts of the building to make it safer for employees here and staff.
Okay, we'll go to the next board member. I have Ms. Perchik to be followed by Mrs. Strauss, Karen Kiss-Gamara, Sandy Evans, Mrs. Schultz, and Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. I believe I have just two questions, so I appreciate the presentation and the direction we're moving in our strategic planning. The first one follows on the safety question asked by Ms. Corbett-Sanders. The one area I have not heard discussed, Mr. Vaccarello, that I know I've mentioned has come up from a couple of community members, a few questions about whether you recommend us looking at the cost of vestibules in schools that are not planned for renovation in the coming, near future. And my other question around temporary classrooms, I don't believe this was in the report, but happy to be corrected if it was. When we talk about those classrooms and, what it takes to reduce those, and when we have those trailers, have we looked at where and how many are associated with programming, whether it's advanced academic programming, pupil placement, or immersion or other programs? How many of those classrooms? I know two of my highest overcapacity schools are AAP centers. So just wondering if you have thoughts on those and recommendations for us to consider those when looking at CIP funding. Thank you.
So on the vestibules, as most of you know, the renovation cycle has those going in at all schools. They're obviously a security standard, a best practice. They're wonderful. They cycle people into the main office. What happens now when people want to add them on out of cycle? And we have we've provided that information as to what the costs are, what schools have them, which schools don't, where they are in the renovation cycle. Where we're at now is what happens when we have communities that want to put them in out of cycle. From an equity standpoint, I'm very cautious of that. Whether community or PTA has the money to do so, I always refer those things to Mr. Plattenberg for decision making. But all I could say on the topic is they're needed. We do it through the renovation cycle, and they're a great security a baseline, frankly.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, as a follow-up, I think there was some information I would love to maybe see. I don't know if we can see in the site, I don't know if it's schools that are not slated to be renovated in the next 3 to 5 years. If it is recommended, what the estimated cost would be, and perhaps, we need a recommendation of how to prioritize or how to create a list. So it is, equitable of, what would make sense to start to find funding for providing that, if it is recommended.
Certainly.
So to answer your second question about trailer removals and looking at how each of the overcrowding issues are impacted by programs, we do sit with the regions, ISD and DSS every year to look at where we need programs and where we have some overcrowding issues and potentially could move a program out of a school. We have done an analysis on AAP, special ed, et cetera. So right now, nothing, there's no great change, but it is one thing that we review during our facilities assessment every time, especially with overcrowding. Will we recommend putting additional programs into a school that's already overcrowded? Do we recommend removing a program from a school that's already stretched to capacity? But there is a balance, which is why we bring our other colleagues in to talk about what access to programs that the students who are assigned to that school have.
Yes, no, and I appreciate that, and I know it is quite a balance, especially when you have other schools that are also over capacity around it. I guess the question would be, is it in a way to just be able to see visually or the information of how many of those trailers are associated with, overcapacity due to programming, pupil placement? I know it's kind of a big ask.
So one thing that we did last year with the CIP is in the capacity tables, which identify the future projections and then the capacity utilization percentages, we added a little footnote to say whether that school itself had, I think footnote 3 was whether it had an AAP program, to just kind of put it all in one place where you could look at the number of schools that were overcrowded and then the number of trailers or modular classrooms, temporary classrooms, and what the projections looked like, so the projected capacity in the out year. And so it was a quick reference, but we also include which programs are at each school, also in a table in the CIP right before each region's capacity tables. So I'm not sure if, I mean, it's there, it's just not very clean and easy, but it
Right.
is one thing that we look at always when we're doing a review of the capacity needs at a school, is what programs are currently at the school.
Right, and I understand that. And I guess the question is just, is there a cleaner, easier way? Because I know we're not on target, unfortunately. Part of it is funding, and we do need to, look at the CIP and where deferred maintenance and capacity concerns are an issue. But I think as this board and future boards are making those decisions, the question really is, can we start to see whether it's by region or in a cleaner way, okay, this many trailers are associated with, overcapacity due to blank programming. I know that's maybe starting with something like people placement or AAP. That's just a question.
And so we could take a look at some of that. We were actually having a conversation today about programs and more of a more visual approach to that. One of the issues that we have is that, and some of the work that Ms. Gillis and her staff do is they go out and work with our principals to try to assess the space within our buildings. It's because our principals use our space in so many different ways. So there isn't one set way that our principals utilize the space. We may provide additional trailers for capacity, but then principals may then choose to use that space for different reasons. So it's hard for us to maybe classify or at least categorize how trailers are being used, because that does change frequently. And I know that again, Ms. Gillis and her staff really do a wonderful job of going out and working with principals. We can work on a way to better represent what that looks like, because again, I'm very visual, and we were looking at some charts today, and I said, this is a great table, but how do we do this so that we can get a better representation by pyramid? So we'll be working on that to the best of our ability and bringing that to the board. But again, one of the things that we do work with is our principals and how they utilize those trailers when they're on the property.
I appreciate that. I know you do, and if you could think about it other ways, I think it would help our system where we're limited on land use here.
It really was part of that conversation today. Dr. Ivy and I were part of a conversation with Dr. Presidio today.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Strauss, to be followed by Karen Camara.
Thank you. And I know that we will be getting much more information on the CIP and after the bond passage, which we assume it will pass, all the rest of that. But, and we know from the various reports from FPAC that obviously efficient use of buildings and when in finishing the renovation queue, where we're able, and I'm assuming it is our expectation as we renovate, we are adding square footage, particularly probably everywhere. Is that correct with the renovation, that we are adding square footage? And obviously it enables us to rearrange a building, which then I would presume that in most cases we are able to get rid of trailers as we renovate, correct?
So our intent is to always provide enough capacity for the district, for each attendance area that the school is. That being said, it doesn't always work as cleanly as we would like it to. So we have schools that have surplus capacity when it's coming out of renovation, and we have schools that are still at 100% or more when it's coming out of renovation for different reasons, to include the programming at the school or changes since we identified the capacity that we set for the design. So the design process, as you all know, is lengthy, and so we're trying to hit a certain target. So those things can change if we change what is happening with the school. We have development within the county that could change in that time where we start the construction of a school and we complete the renovation.
Right.
So we also, we don't always add square footage, but we will add enough programming space to meet the current ed specs, the education specifications that we have adopted as an organization. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like a one-for-one, like if we replace a trailer that's 800 square feet, we would necessarily add an additional 800 square feet. It's just the way that we use it. Oftentimes we're using full-size classrooms for programs that don't need that full-size classroom space. And so we're putting that classroom out into a trailer when we could bring it in when we do have a smaller room that's an instructional space that would meet the need of that program.
Okay, so efficient use of space.
Exactly. We increase the efficiency.
And I guess just a sort of a large question, which maybe you just get a ballpark answer. With the current bond, if that funding comes and we actually are able to spend it in the way in which it is planned, what will that impact have on current trailers? Do we know? I mean, I'm assuming that using those bonds in the way in which we've projected, that we will be able to get rid of some trailers, correct?
Yeah, I would imagine. I know that we'll get rid of several,
Okay.
but I don't know the exact number, but we
Right.
can provide that in our next step.
Just in a ballpark, yeah, because people have asked that.
I don't know what the ballpark would be. So by the time the whole thing would be completed, so with our bond, the construction
It's
projects.
30 years, I know.
In each one, so I can't give a ballpark exactly. I know that we have, 10 at some and 5 at others, and no trailers at a different school.
Right.
So I can pull it together.
Just sort of. You don't have to work too hard at it. But I've been asked that question, and my answer is always, I assume, even though we count noses every month and every year and adjust all of our projections and do everything that we can, the assumption is that if we are building and renovating, we're hopefully staying ahead of growth and getting rid of some trailers. So, okay, thank you.
Ms. Karen-Camara, to be followed by Sandy Evans.
Okay, so I'm going to continue on the theme of trailers, but I know, and I know you guys have a plan. I'd like to know, how are we prioritizing with respect to how we deal with the trailers? And is there certain things that we're looking for? Is it a safety concern? Is it exactly, how are we, trying to address those concerns? I know there have been folks who met with me and Ms. Evans with respect to how we approach the security issues, and we've received various bits of information, and the community is very concerned about this issue, so I'm wondering how we can perhaps incorporate some of those discussions without compromising safety at all. And then my last question has to do with possibly contemplating flexibility space, so that we've had some folks come to testify, as well as people that I've met in the community, about just kind of having mental health space available so that kids can have a place to go and be quiet and read. Not necessarily the library, but some place where it's not, they may want to pray there, they may want to, where they may want to do their yoga. Is that something that we can contemplate? I understand the crunch we have in many of our schools, but people are asking these questions, so I thought I would pose it.
So with regard to the looking at the space, we can certainly take a look at any recommendations that school staff might have in terms of reconfiguring space to make the building more amenable for the needs of students. And so, again, we certainly work with schools all the time to think about how we can convert space for instructional needs or convert space for this type of flexible needs. So we are certainly open to that, and we'll certainly bring information back to the board based on ed specs, based on where we see schools moving in the future. I've just been doing some reading recently on how far behind we as a nation are on sort of the brick and mortar space in schools, and that there's a catch-up that we'll have to do very quickly to ensure that we have spaces that are going to meet the needs of students 10, 15 years out. So that's something we can certainly look at. In terms of those safety concerns, I'll let Mr. Vaccarello talk about some of the safety work that he does with schools.
Can I just say something? Because you did touch on a concern. There may be schools where this is more relevant than other schools, right? There may be schools where kids need, I know I've been to schools where they actually have mindfulness programs, or they have a number of students asking for a place to pray, or whatever those needs might be. So this, if as we're looking at this, we can be mindful of what those needs are. And the other part of that would be, and I guess this is the next step, the other part of that would be, what are some of those things that we need to be mindful of in terms of catching up, right? What are those best practices that we should be considering as we're looking at our spaces?
So again, that's part of that tug and pull that we have with wanting to provide different and more unique spaces within buildings, and then also wanting to reduce our reliance on trailers and spaces outside of the building. So when we work very directly with schools, trying to get a better understanding of their needs, we can certainly work to see where we can best, again, meet the needs of students based on what the community is asking for. In terms of that larger push toward what schools will look like, with some of the reading that I've done, that there'll be more reliance on technology, less reliance on schools, less reliance on brick and mortar. We'll see students who are wanting to access the curriculum from other places than a school building, and so how do we deal with that as a country? How do we deal with that as a system? So those are things that we'll have to consider as we think about ed specs. I know that there are some places that have gotten rid of their ed specs altogether and are trying to be, again, more responsive to the immediate needs of an individual community. So those are things that we'll have to look at. But again, at this point, we're very open to working with our principals and with our communities to try to create the space that's necessary within those schools, while also understanding that we don't want to necessarily add any additional trailer space to get there. So how do we reconfigure current space so that it's a win-win for everyone?
I see I still have 6 seconds, but it would be good, I think, for this board to have a look toward the future with respect to what those considerations should be, or what we should possibly be thinking about, even though we may not be able to do it today in terms of long-range planning.
And Ms. Gillis is very forward-thinking, and we've already started having some of those conversations in terms of what these spaces should look like for students in the future, and that we have to start building toward the future instead of building for what our needs are today. I know that there were some questions about trailers and the safety concerns for trailers. I was at a school just a couple of weeks ago doing a walk to look at the trailers, look at safety concerns for students. Again, that's another area where we work very closely with our school teams to ensure that we are providing as safe ingress and egress to the building as possible. And again, those additional security positions that were afforded us in the budget last year provide us the staffing necessary to be more responsive to the needs of administrators when they're asking for that kind of help. Mr. Vaccarello?
To follow on Marty, well said, and we're already working towards those efforts when you talk about incorporating the discussion when it comes to security of trailers. So we've already added this year a third more elementary schools to our, we always call them tabletop training, but it's safety and security training followed by a tabletop exercise. So approximately 50 elementary schools fell into that every other year approach, and then we now saturate the system next year with every school annually getting that same training. And we address these things. We address trailer security, how to manage an event that involves trailers. It's pushed forth. We're really excited, and we all should be, about the launch of our video content coming up in the spring. We're working with leadership now. That change in paradigm for our safety training is going to be, it will result in us sitting back here next year and achieving these goals, I believe, at a high level when these surveys go out to parents and communities, because they're now going to get firsthand. They're going to look at these and the light's going to go on in their head, and followed up by the training. So launching of that content, which has to also to do with the social emotional guidance that's going to be provided by DSS, is really important. It's the buzzword these days. The lockdown has come under lots of criticism. The drills alone, do we really need them? What kind of impact are they causing our kids? But I believe we're forward thinking in that, and come winter, spring, you'll see a big change in, I believe, people's ideas and comfortability around safety and security. I lose the argument about trailers. I can't win it all the time. Brick and mortar is a safer environment, but our trailers are still secure, and we give guidance, and they lock, and they have all the mechanisms we need for support for emergency situations.
So would it be possible for this board to understand the priority with respect to reducing the trailers? Like, we have 750. What's the plan, or what's the priority in terms of eliminating them, was part of my question. Yes. How are those decisions being made?
So, and I can give you 10% of the answer. That's all that I'm worth in the security world for trailers. The trailer is more of a process of what design and construction does.
Let's wait till we have 100%, I think, Mr. Vaccarello, for the board for a next step on this one, because trailers is it is in the strategic plan if we could. I do want you to know I pulled the bond information, 4,400 more seats for students in this bond, 100 portable classrooms will be eliminated. So that was the information I know you were looking for. And we're very helpful about that. And I just want to share, I think that was what Ms. Strauss had asked. You'd asked another question too about, wellness or students for praying. One of the things I think we can do short term, Marty's right, we need to have an eye to the future for the new design. We may be able to put out some best practices right now that principals can use. When I was a principal at Herndon, we had a large Muslim community. They asked to use the lecture hall during the school day and after school. We were able to make some flexible arrangements for use of the lecture hall for other things that were scheduled for instruction to allow those kids to have it. When I was at Fairfax High School, we had a group of students who asked during Ramadan, could I, instead of going to the cafeteria every day, may I go to the library and not have to get a pass and go through the normal processes that we had for the library in entering and exiting. There's also a way on the master schedule for middle and high schools to run open classrooms per period, even when we're maximized with the large student population. There are certain classrooms that are open per period. So students who wanted to go to pray or meditate during a certain period. So I think there's a few best practice just tips that we can give all principals to make sure they're standardizing their approach when we have kids come forward for these other special needs. And I'll talk with Mr. Smith and actually Dr. Duran and see about putting something together.
Okay.
Sure. When we're done, I'll put it out.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Evans to be followed, Mr. Schorsch, and Mr. Wilson.
So I appreciate what Dr. Brabrand said about best practices. I think that is something that all of our principals would welcome. I know Justice High School has a room for their Muslim students, but because there's such a lack of space right now, and they're squeezing out every inch that they have there, that's been a smaller space. So any advice that and that it has a very large Muslim population. So I had a couple of comments and then a couple of questions. One is on the mental health support. I certainly support more mental health supports. I think that we need to continue our progress on that front. And with the trailers, this is a bit counterintuitive and kind of a small item, I suppose. But I did talk to one principal who said that she had a trailer taken out when she really didn't want it taken out. She was using it not for classroom space, but for other things. And I guess the answer came back, well, the school board wants to get rid of trailers. And so I don't think, our point is we don't want kids in classrooms in trailers. I would hope we would have a little bit of flexibility for any principal who said this is actually useful for me in another way. Because it's not just a number we're looking for. It's the point about taking kids out of classrooms. And two other things. These are my two questions. One is the middle school principals have made their top priority this year having internal cameras for security. They believe that that's for their advocacy this year, that's their top priority. So I wanted to get a sense of whether we can expect to see that being placed into the superintendent's budget. I guess if you want to stop the clock, Dr. Brabrand looks like he wants to answer that question.
I do want to, what Mr. Smith said was 100% accurate. We have a whole day budget process where we're going line by line through every department and school request. Middle schools, ironically, you know, when you ask folks to get filter and focus, our associations, probably for the first time, I think, in years, have all come down and said, we have 1 or 2 key priorities. I said, we need to begin to narrow and apply it to a strategic plan. The middle school only brought 1, and it is middle school cameras. So I don't have the plan yet, but it is in front of us to review. I do plan to bring a recommendation by the time that I bring my budget to you in January, but I don't have an answer yet. But we are taking a hard look at it, and we wanted cameras to have, obviously, preventative impact, and Mr. Vaccarello can talk a little bit more about that, but also in terms of post, being able to quickly resolve an issue and help us in investigations and deal with the issue of teacher workload, which is real, but also administrator workload. We want administrators in classrooms, supporting teachers, helping teachers, and not having to run down discipline incidences. And we can really sometimes, like police are now doing with body-worn cameras, removing bias and having an equity lens and looking at the interactions to say whether something was really student generated or maybe something that an adult could have had a different approach. So we're going to take a hard look at it and should have some recommendations for the budget.
All right, well, I do appreciate that, and this would, I believe, be pretty much one-time funding, so just a thought, you could possibly put it in mid-year.
Do you must have a microphone on our meeting, so we're looking at a multiple set of things.
All right. Just a thought. So I only have one other question, and that's I appreciate Ms. Keys-Gamarra raising the issues that the community has brought to us in terms of safety. And so I did just want to follow up, Mr. Vaccarello. I appreciate very much you meeting with some community members and Ms. Keys-Gamarra and myself. And I know you followed up with some of your counterparts in surrounding jurisdictions. I did want to find out if from those conversations have we modified anything we're doing? Are we looking at something else? I know one of the issues with the Alice approach was our not being able to barricade doors, and I was trying to figure out why it is that they can barricade doors and we can't. If we have any more insights on that, or if we're confident that our approach is the better approach.
I'll answer the later. I'm confident it's the better approach. It just seems to be a misconception that we don't have an options-based approach. We do. We do not, and I've said it before openly, we do not instruct or teach staff and students to combat or to fight bad people. That's very clear. We are still working through the barricading issue. We're still told by the fire marshal we cannot barricade a door, we cannot use devices to barricade a door. They've got to have a one-motion release, but we're working on that still with them based upon our buildings being sprinklered as to what that guidance can be. So we did look at, we met with a couple of security professionals in the area, our Alexandria County Schools and some others. They have used a modified Alice approach. And the biggest thing that they do, that we don't do, they actually practice what they call an evacuation. And not just a drill of evacuation like we do. We evacuate and we go outside. They actually evacuate to their off-site as part of a lockdown process. We instruct our staff and teachers that they can evacuate only when they know it's safe to do so. So those are the two major differences. We did meet with the Mora group of students that also wanted to talk about Alice-based approach. A wonderful meeting of 7th and 8th graders at Kilmer Middle School. We're following up with them on questions and answers. And as I told that group and all groups, we're looking at this with eyes wide open. We're not stuck into, we only are going to do this because we know better. We know we have to change continually in this atmosphere. Bad guys change, bad guys and gals change. So we continue to look at the processes. We're going to continue to look at what other options we can offer. But in my response to Ms. Keys-Gamarra, again, very excited about what we're rolling out here in the spring. And you'll see, again, a marked difference of opinion. We're never going to get 100% satisfaction in this area. But I'm confident that we have it the right approach. Lockdowns, when implemented correctly, do in fact save lives.
Thank you very much for that explanation and for your work on this. Are our fire laws different than Alexandria and Arlington? Is that one of the, is that why they can do it and we can't, or no? Is it just an interpretation?
I think it's an interpretation, and I'm not an expert on it. It has taken half of my staff and the state fire marshal, the local fire marshal, Fairfax County, to try to figure this thing out. And all I can tell you is we're working on it. They've told us that they do not support it, and we cannot barricade doors, but we're working on it.
Thank you. I have Mr. Schultz to be followed by Mr. Wilson.
So I have just some generic questions to start with. One of the things that I brought to you when I originally did the forum topic last year was the question of using ballistic material not devices, but very smart vendors have found ways to work in things like ballistic material into whiteboards and things that could be pushed in front of doors. You had mentioned, the windows. I wonder where we are on any of that. Two is any technology. Are we looking at technology, and is that only able to be put in when we're doing renovations? Administrative facilities. That was originally part of my forum topic, was not only because of Parkland, but also because of Annapolis, it's not just our students and the employees that are in school buildings, but also in our administrative facilities. So the status of that. A slightly different approach, or from a different perspective, because we always say temporary classrooms, and temporary classrooms doesn't mean modulars or quads or pods or whatever we're going to call them. So the lack of clarity, I think, that exists within the CIP or in our resources are those just permanently, that's a permanent solution. It's still temporary, but it's a permanent solution. Are we planning to get ourselves out of basically I'm going to say non-brick and mortar buildings? And then, Dr. Brabrand, from an instructional standpoint, when I've been meeting with the region assistant superintendents talking about the detailed student achievement data per building, is anybody looking at, and sort of this is like the bigger holistic 3D model of what's the culture in the building? If you marry all of our strategic goals, what's the culture in the building? Is the culture in the building different when we have these high pressure, very small amounts of itinerant teacher space? My sixth grade son heard that we were the second wealthiest county in the nation, and he said, "How come I don't have an art room?" They still have art on a cart because there's no square footage for even, the basics. And then what does that do for student achievement? Have we looked at, is student achievement affected as we spread kids out into trailers or into quads, and is it interfering with instructional time? So those are kind of two ends of it, but I'm interested in hearing that, and I probably might want to go back. I think the beginning questions might be in Mr. Vaccarella's area.
Thank you. So with ballistic material, I'll gently touch on that in front of the group. So we are considering some technologies that have ballistic quality in certain areas of schools, that, as we call it, buying time at a door or a window. In addition to that, when we talk about ballistic qualities in a classroom, and I know what you're referring to as far as whiteboards and things like that, we have not done a deep dive into that because we believe our physical stance and structure as it stands right now to stop a intended threat is solid. And I'd be glad to talk a little bit more about the ballistic material piece, Mylar filming, things like that. We actually are looking at some of that currently with some minor funding.
Those are in those expanded, the expanded recommendations from the report last summer?
They are.
Okay.
Moving on to technology, we meet and talk with vendors all the time. We're looking at shot detection technology. Currently, we're looking at applications for immediate notifications to law enforcement. Technology always, some seem to push this towards what's driven by a server or what's driven by a computer. Locks are part of that. Technology, although it's a physical security. We're looking at lock technology, which is really important in school security. Other technologies that we're looking at when it comes to CCTV and cameras, they do come with analytic capabilities that can do some predictions of the movement of people, things like that. As far as admin facilities, if I can jump ahead to that as well, we have gone and conducted on-site training for all of our admin facilities over the last year and a half or 2 years. Everyone.
Just as a clarification, I don't mean the training of the people. That I completely get that. I just meant the physical plant, like if there was anything that we needed to, because I know some of those buildings we lease, you know, we don't own. They're not our buildings, we lease. So I actually just meant the physical plant. I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify.
Well, thank you. Some of that rolled out training does include a security assessment. Let me get that back to you as a next step because I have a list of those. We've gone to, I'm not going to guess at the number, several of our buildings. We've done security reviews. We've done security enhancements. We've put door security in place that wasn't in place. We've added door readers where it need to be read. And we have these things in place now. I'll get you that list as to what we're doing, what type of upgrades we've done. Most of it surrounds the hardening, door access, CCTV, wearing your badge, things of that nature. We have done full assessments, as Mr. Smith commented, for Gatehouse and Willow Oaks, and we can discuss those whenever that's appropriate.
Is there some of this that needs to come to us in a closed session?
We can certainly work with the board if you'd like to get some of that detail.
I would request, that's another next step. I would like for us to have a more detailed conversation. I think some of it certainly, and I get the professionalism that Mr. Vaccarello brings to this and what he's trying to do very gently, but that leads me to ask. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can somebody answer the question?
So with that, I'm going to excuse Dr. Brain. He's got another meeting somewhere else, and we'll have Dr. Ivy instead.
Okay, and my remaining question was on the side of the kind of approach of the culture plus student achievement and buildings versus what the facility is like.
So I'm not aware of any studies on that, and I know that as we think about the space that we have in buildings, it goes back to the earlier discussion about principals and communities thinking about the needs of their building and how we can make recommendations. I know with one of our primary goals of reducing our reliance on trailers is that you talk about your son not having an art room in the building, and when we think about that kind of space in the building, and if there are programs that could be on a cart or in a trailer so that we could bring students for safety reasons or for instructional reasons into a building, into some of those spaces. Some of the recommendations have been to utilize those interior spaces. Now that's not to take away from a particular program. It would again be for us to think about how we use modulars, which we see as permanent structures within the county, and perhaps the expansion of those types of buildings to preserve some of those spaces within our buildings for fine arts, music, art rooms, et cetera. But again, as we think about balancing the needs of trying to bring students in from exterior buildings, utilizing space that we currently have, those are the kinds of discussions that we have with principals. And we do know that there are principals who choose to keep those spaces, and we don't force them to. We can make recommendations. But again, it's really about the needs of that building and the value that the folks in the building place on particular spaces.
And was there an answer to, is there an attempt or a plan to move out of modulars as well? Or are those just permanent solutions, and can we put those more clearly in the CIP so it's clear what's a brick and mortar, what's a modular, and what's a trailer? No, it's not as clear on modulars, because that's considered like quad space.
Last year, they actually identified which schools had how many modulars, and what you're asking is actual square footage?
Yeah.
Okay, that would be great.
So this year, in the table that we have included in the back, we have like an appendix with each school, the year that it was open, the year it was modified, and then renovated. Then we have separated out the building square footage and the modular square footage, not including the trailer square footage, because as you said, they're temporary. But if the building is, let's say, 100,000 square feet and the modular is 10,000 square feet, we list them both, and we list the total for the capacity. I think that you had requested that of us before.
Yes, I did. And are you building into, when you say, the 777 or whatever number that was, are you building the plan? Is there also a plan to get us out of the modulars too, or we just have to do the trailers first?
So we haven't focused on getting us out of the modular, so to speak, but what happens when we renovate a school that currently has a modular, we relocate that to a school that has a need for additional capacity. So oftentimes we'll move it to another school and remove the trailers, the temporary classrooms that were there, and replace it with a modular. So it's still within the renovation queue, that school that we will remove the trailers and put the modular in. So we'll move it out of the school that's being constructed, move it to a school that has a bunch of trailers. We'll get the trailers out, put a more permanent structure as in the modular, and then keep it with, because as you realize that we have the 37-year renovation cycle, so we would like to, but that's like the second, it's another bridging the gap, but we feel like it's better than just continuing to add trailers.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Wilson next.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. So if we could just go to slide 9. This is the adequate classroom space slide. I really appreciated the question actually that Ms. Strauss asked, and then I think Dr. Brabrand answered about how many trailers would be eliminated through the implementation of the bond funding. But now I'm struggling to try to understand what's labeled as cost description in the ROI, because it talks about $314,500 in CIP funds, eliminate classroom, a trailer, and obviously 100 into our bond issuance comes up to a much bigger number than 314.5. So how can the public understand what this means?
So the 314.5 is the facility's estimate of how much it costs to actually build a classroom as part of a school renovation. So that's what the 314.5 is. Obviously, the building of those classrooms takes place within the broader renovation, and so that 35.6 number is how much during last year the school renovations themselves cost.
Okay, so explain that in terms of the 100 trailers and the bond offering then. What does that mean then? How did we get to 100?
So the 100 is coming from what the existing trailers are right now at the projects that are on the bond. So the 100 is just that rough number of trailers that would be included in, like right now, if we added them all up in the CIP, it would be 100 trailers we would be eliminating through the construction project, through the renovation and the additions.
I mean, I'm not in the weeds of this, but to me, it'd be a much more accurate description to say that the 100 classrooms we eliminated with this bond offering results so that in terms of CIP funds, the total CIP funds that we would have to have as much, it's a larger number than 314.5. So I think this is a little bit, maybe I don't know how to rewrite it, but maybe think about a way to present this so that I think the public might have a misunderstanding about the cost associated with eliminating trailers. And I guess the next bullet there, it talks about to eliminate all trailers would cost $245 million in CIP funds. Again, I think if people look at this year's bond offering, they might think, well, why aren't we getting rid of all of the trailers? Because our bond offering should cover 777 trailers, right? I think that we just need to make sure that we're clear to the public when we're describing how we get rid of trailers and where that cost is, because what you've described is it's really just an embedded cost of the overall cost of a construction project to add the square footage to create new classrooms to eliminate a trailer. But that means that actually you've got to do multiple projects over multiple bond offerings to get there. And so maybe you got to connect it to time so that people can understand. All right, so that's one thing. And the second thing really is for you, Mr. Vaccarello, but it is in the presentation. On slide 10, it talks about staff and families and students considering school safe, and that we're talking about perceptions of safety. I think that I'd like to see that we have concluded that the schools are safe, right? It's because perception is really one bad episode away from plummeting. And so perception's not that meaningful for me. And so I would like to hear you talk about some of the testing that we do to make sure that schools are secure, because as I've visited schools, I can tell you it really varies. And so how are we testing to make sure the schools are following their security and safety plans? And how do we correct them? And what is our ongoing training? Because these are brought to me by residents, and a lot of times it's in elementary schools where we don't have an armed security guard, and the varying approach towards those door security measures really makes me nervous that we've got vestibule enhancements that are tied to a 37-year renovation plan. And we may need to look at how can we accelerate that, because if we can't figure out a way to get staff to really implement with discipline the door security, then we've got to figure out an alternative to safeguard against that.
So, Mr. Wilson, let me take one thing. On the survey. We're going through the first full iteration of the strategic plan with the indicators, right? And we've talked a little bit with the board about, as we keep moving forward, feedback around the indicators. One of the things, and it came up in Goal 2, and I'm hearing a little bit even here in Goal 4, and we want to partner with you. We developed, as we did when we built this, some of the indicators are based on surveys. Goal 2 is based on a lot of surveys, the youth survey. Here, this one is the school climate survey. Do we want to continue to relook at whether we want survey data or other types of data to measure safety and security? And we're certainly willing to work with you all to come up with what that would be.
Yeah, I think the caring culture, that we have requires that students feel safe and families feel safe. But that's separate from a return on investment in terms of actual
nuts and bolts incidences,
security and safety, right?
Yeah,
so
understood.
We've got to have them separate.
So we can combine, and maybe it's not taking away, but it's adding in and enhancing it with some of those other pieces. Some of which maybe could be public, and some which maybe would be better
in a closed session,
shared privately. But we can figure out how to come up with what those metrics would look like.
Okay, any further responses from staff to Mr. Wilson? If not, I'll go to Mrs. McLaughlin next.
So I was lucky to be sitting next to Dr. Brabrand, so he already knows what I'm about to say. So you get going. Don't be late for your meeting. First of all, it was great to follow behind Mr. Wilson because he captured quite a few of the areas that I have concerns about. So if we can go back to the slide where it showed the $314,000 that's estimated to, replace a classroom, that whole bullet, I mentioned to Scott, I think he gets it, that has got to be rewritten. I'm not a facilities expert, but I did remember even my own home renovation and estimating $314,000 for a classroom. I mean, what is that per square footage we're saying? Like, it just feels like it was kind of a neat and tidy way of saying, when we did this, so now we're going to say that's how we cost estimated that. So I think that one's problematic and doesn't serve the report well. The safety and security measures, Scott was talking about the survey. Mr. Wilson brought up the survey. I had a huge problem with it. I was making notes as people were talking. Perception versus objective analysis. Perception means either maybe we're not doing a good enough job to communicate out what our objective analysis was, and perception and survey responses will improve when we actually bring that objective information to the community. So parents may have a perception that the schools aren't safe, then we do the objective analysis, we inform them how we've affirmed that it's safe, and then they're going to feel a whole lot better about it. So even talking in the public right now, people who don't know that this school board and this school system invested over $300 million in teacher salaries are still saying to me, you're not paying teachers enough. We're losing teachers to other counties. That's perception. That has no place in a report that the superintendent brings to a board and says, here's how we are, fulfilling our resource stewardship and the issues of safety. So I will say to my colleagues on a macro level, I don't know how we keep finding ourselves each year with these goal reports, but I turned to Dr. Braber and I said, a lot of these metrics, I don't feel that they're robust. They exist. We can plug them into this report, but when I think about all the really great work, Mr. Vaccarello, your office does, this report doesn't capture it by a long shot. And I think it's a disservice, actually, to the Office of Safety and Security for the great things you guys have done for resource stewardship and safety. And so some staff are familiar with me saying, and my colleagues are too, there are times I just can't even vote for a goal report because I don't think it actually captures the work we've done nor puts confidence in the public. And honestly, I guess what I'd really love to see is maybe we need to have a task force, a working group of the school board to say, how do we really make sure that these goal reports are substantive and that the metrics matter? And I see I ran out of my time, but there's a lot more I could say about this report. I just want to end on a positive note. I know everybody's working really hard at resource stewardship, and I will appreciate that, and I'll try to figure out how to say that when we vote on this report. But right now, I don't think this reflects FCPS in its best work.
Response?
So I was just walking down the hall, and I think I know where the conversation was going because of conversations that I've had with Ms. McLaughlin. But there are opportunities for us within the strategic planning process. There are opportunities for the board to look at the metrics and targets that we've established. As Dr. Brabrand said, this is a full cycle for us, and so we're going to be bringing the board opportunities to review those metrics and targets to see if this is the if these are the things that we would want to measure, and if these are the targets that provide the best information for us to make decisions, both internally as staff and internally as the board. So we're certainly open to working more closely with the board and developing better metrics and targets that that you would feel better represent the work that we're doing in Fairfax County, and that would give you the information that you need to make better decisions, and give the community the information that they need to get a better view of who we are and what we do in Fairfax County. So we are actually in the process of pulling together recommendations that school board members have asked up to this point, and we'll be bringing that to the board to review before we go through the next cycle. So I only heard the last few minutes or the few seconds walking down the hallway, but I hope that I was able to capture what you were getting at, Ms. McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Smith. And so I want to make sure, Madam Clerk, my next step is going to be that we provide the board with a timeline of how and when we will actually have this conversation and reviewing the metrics for the next Goal 4 report.
Certainly, we can do that.
Any other board member who has not spoken yet? Okay, anybody who wants to be on, go back? Mrs. McLean, why don't you go ahead?
So one of the things that I wanted to, in my go back, touch upon is that with the board's interest in the trailers issue, I know that I'm hearing in my community also the concerns about the extensive wait list on SAC. And when we're trying to draw down trailers, but we have, as I understand it, across our various schools where the SAC program exists, some have more liberal use of those SAC rooms where they can be used as instructional space during the day. And then I'm told some SAC rooms, they're off limits and not being used for instruction. And so I was wondering if someone could speak a little bit more about where we are on that.
Unfortunately, we had Anne Marie Toohey here, who could have spoken very clearly to that point as the director for the Office for Children, and they're responsible for SAC. And we do know that there are more liberal uses of some of those spaces. We work very closely with the Office for Children as we think about SAC space in our schools. We know that those are additional spaces that some principals view them as spaces that are only for SAC. Other principals work with us to figure out how best to utilize those spaces during the day for instructional purposes. I think one thing for us is working more closely with Dr. Ivy and RAS and our executive principals as we think about how we communicate to our principals how those spaces can be used. And then, again, working and collaborating more closely with our colleagues on the county to get a better sense of what their needs are for those spaces. I've already had some conversations with Joe Mondoro about how they utilize those spaces, and I've already engaged in some conversations around different models for SAC and different models for after-school programs. That there was a time when our SAC folks in our Office for Children felt that the static classroom inside the building was the best model for a SAC program. But I know that 25, well, close to 30 years ago in a previous life when I first started in education, I was the director of an after-school program, and we were in the library, and we were in the cafeteria. So there are different models that are out there, and I think that the Office for Children, they're open to looking at different models for their SAC programs, which would relieve and free up some space for us to be able to use those classrooms differently for instructional purposes.
I appreciate that, Mr. Smith. You captured what my macro level concern is with your comment on how we're using the SAC spaces and how different principals might want to utilize them during the instructional day. And that was also ties into something that was said earlier by school board member inquiries on our program capacity and how we're using our buildings. I think there's a real challenge here that our principals are educators. Many of them came up as being teachers, then assistant principals, now principals. They're not building capacity experts. They're not building utilization experts. They're principals. And while their voices are very important, the role that I see central administration, and particularly out of the Department of Facilities and Transportation, is to bring the best practice approach on how we are utilizing every one of our 200 buildings to maximum effect, to reduce trailers. And I believe our principals want to partner with the facilities office in maximizing the usage, so we reduce the trailer usage. But tonight I've definitely heard several times that a lot of it can vary principal to principal, and I don't think that's actually a good operational model. And same thing with the SAC situation. My colleagues, I'll let you know, I've already reached out to Supervisor Cook's office, and he is retiring, so we'll see who the new Braddock supervisor is. But it is long past due that the school board and the board of supervisors, along with staff, have a working group that looks at SAC, looks at the SAC room utilization, and looks at the fact that we've got very long SAC wait lists, that our families are coming to us thinking we run it because it sits in our building. And we need to be a voice for our working families, just like we were talking about pre-K and childcare, early childcare. Well, existing childcare for school-age children is a very big deal in this county. And so I want that on my next steps marker, that we need to do that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now she left. Mrs. Schultz left. So I'm going to take my turn then. I didn't really want to talk about trailers, but I still got to ask a question or two. Trailers, if you don't mind.
Okay, Mr. Moon.
All right. The 69 trailers eliminated, that is great. But out of those 69, only 60 were eliminated along with the renovations, which means that only 9 out of 69 was eliminated, perhaps by generating some efficiency within school buildings. Is that a fair assumption?
So 32 were actually eliminated that way, but during the same year, another 23, is that the right number? 23 were added in. And so the net was 9, but 32 were actually eliminated through efficiencies, but they were offset by the 23 that were added back in.
And those 23 that were added back in could have been part of a program review that we were doing, looking at the needs of a particular building and bringing those additional trailers in to support the population of that school based on programmatic needs.
Okay, when you said 23 were brought back in, what part of that 23 had to do with the capacity, increased capacity of schools, and you need to bring in more trailers? Is it all of them?
All of the 23 would have been specifically put at a school for capacity concerns. Those 23 that we added were specifically due to overcrowding at certain schools.
Okay. Thank you. I feel better that there were 32, trailers eliminated, realizing somewhat efficiency of the use of the space. Because I remember, having conversation with Mr. Plattenberg that our overall strategy of eliminating has to be three-legged stool. It's a renovation, program efficiency, or efficiency of use of space, and potential boundary change, which means, 1/3 every time, at least 1/3 of the trailers, elimination of trailers would have to be based upon, better use of the space. And I'm glad to know there was a 30 and not just a 9. Okay, thank you. With that, I have some board members back. So Mr. Schultz next, and then Ms. Kiss-Kamara.
So I'm just going to add my 2 cents in. Having started in commercial real estate development, the sort of notion around the table that, this only works if the current bond and the current plan involves schools that currently have trailers. I don't think, you cannot buckle one to the other. And I don't buy it. I actually don't buy it, because I know that an elementary school classroom and a middle school classroom and a high school classroom, and whether the high school classroom is a science lab or, an English classroom, an ELA, they're completely different. And this is an average of an average of an average in a year where it might actually replace. So I think that just needs to go. You could say, in this particular bond cycle, the planned renovations will ultimately eliminate, because of the schools that are involved, 100 or however many classrooms it will. That's something entirely different. The second thing that I had is the $35.6 million. I don't understand where that comes from, because a high school is going to be in the 70s to hundreds plus. A middle school is in the 40s to 50s. Now, maybe we're renovating more elementary schools and it's bringing down the total cost. But again, that should be an average elementary full renovation costs this, an average middle school full renovation costs this, an average high school, because they're vastly different. If you're, buying a car for yourself versus a car for your kids, you can't say the average, it's just not the same. That was a terrible analogy, but Ms. McLaughlin, you sort of hit on what I had written, is that, and Mr. Vaccarello, that the survey is one thing. The survey is the perception of what happens out there. What's part of, I think, the response is okay, when there's a gap between the survey and information that we have, or we haven't effectively communicated information that we have, that that there has been, your statement here tonight should sort of almost be a press release that we have done an in-depth dive, and our schools are safe. That doesn't mean that there aren't places that we need to improve. We do. And we can never tell a parent that if the child is in a temporary trailer or modular outside a brick and mortar facility, that they're safer. We can't, or that it's equal. It's not. So, but we have a mindset to get rid of these trailers and stop using temporary solutions for permanent problems. But in the meantime, on the gap analysis, say, look, most people think our schools are safe. And for those who don't, here's some information that may help. That rounds out the conversation. Sorry, I had one other thing. I don't remember what it is.
Okay, thank you. One last one on my list is Karen Kiskamara. Did you? Okay, good, great. With the next steps then. How many we have? Do we have up to 140? Oh, 150. Okay.
I'm sorry. The cost per pupil?
Okay. We'll start from the top. Start from the top. Please read 141 through 148. That because that's the only. Well, we can only see up to 148.
Okay. So
and take a look at the language, and then we're gonna start from the top. 141. Does that capture your language?
It's actually, what is the impact on getting rid of trailers if we fully implement the pre-K classrooms at the same number of new classrooms that we did when we added all-day K?
Could you do that one more time? That was
so
pretty long.
Essentially, when we added all-day K, we ended up with something like 700 trailers. Is that correct?
Yeah, we prepared this information previously, I believe, for a next step. It was, if we looked at the kindergarten age or pre-K age, it was like a difference between, if we're just looking at 4-year-olds, like almost 900 or almost 1,000 additional classrooms will be needed. And if we were looking at 3 to 4 to 5-year-olds, that age range. It was
All
like
right, you
1,600.
can provide the same information again.
So-
Let's have a full sentence about what you want to get. What is the impact
Impact
on
on
getting rid of
our goal of getting rid of trailers.
That makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, I know, it was. If we fully implement
Pre-K
pre-K
class.
classrooms for 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds.
So it's a different answer on the analysis. So we brought the actual numbers, so then there's what's the impact of that on our ability? We understand that.
That's what I'm looking for, is can we achieve our goal if we end up doing this? But we need to do this as part of a decision support matrix.
So, okay, 141.
The second one is, what would be the impact on capacity if we were to decrease class size for math and science classes at the secondary level? To a threshold of 24 students.
So are you looking at costs for that, or
Once again, because it's all supply and demand. So we decrease the size of our classes, we increase the number of classes we need. We increase the number of classes we need. Where is the capacity? Do we need to add trailers? Or how does that impact our end goal of getting rid of trailers? And so every time we make decisions based on how we spend our money. In this case, we make decisions on how we spend our capacity.
So, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, are you looking for a specific number in terms of number of classrooms and amount of?
Because some of that would be through a number of classrooms or additional trailer space, but some of that is refurbishing and changing more lab space. So there are things that we can do with additional trailers, but then there are things that we have to do through internal renovation. So
That's more personnel too, because if you have more iterations of a session, then
So instead of 32, 3 sessions or 4 classes of 32, you end up with 5 classes at 24. That means you need one more teacher, but you also need one more classroom.
Yeah, so we can look at the impact on classrooms. We can also provide a little bit on staffing piece as well.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to the next one, 143. This is Ms. Corbett-Sanders again.
I think it was more, what is the cost? It was basically reiterating something that I know Ms. Schultz has raised numerous times too, which is doing the review of our non-school-based buildings and making sure that they have safety measures in place.
Well, I think that's handled by my number 148, because what Mr. Vaccarello told us is that has been done, but the conversation needs to be had and closed.
Okay, well, so I had asked that before, so I'm happy to combine them or whatever, but yes, that's precisely it, is that we're all echoing the same concerns.
Okay, so
I don't know if you want me to do what's 147 now, but schedule closed session to discussion on safety assessments and improvements.
Made or needed.
Made or needed,
Or recommended.
including administrative facilities.
That works.
okay, so 147 is done, and let's go back up to 143 then.
So I believe that's mine. Yeah, I guess, and Ms. Gillis had a good way of saying this. It was just sort of streamlining or clarifying the information of trailers as they relate to, it's not after-school programs, but rather AAP and other AAP, pupil placement, and other specialized programs. Specialized.
That was a better visual representation of what that looked like, of the groupings and what the impacts were, so that you could see it easily without having to look at multiple.
Right, yes. And then in addition, I know it wasn't put up there, and it can also be combined into Ms. Corbett Sanders and Ms. Schultz if they'd like, but I had a question about vestibules when it comes to the safety review.
Can you just tell me, because I might want to add something, can you say again what 143 is? Can you help me understand?
So what it says, so.
Clarify.
And what was it, Mr. Smith? It was
A better visual representation of
Thank
of where our programs are and what that impact is by pyramid, and feeder pattern.
Are you talking about identifying what trailers are used for? Like how they're used? Are they used for AAP? Is that what you mean?
So we have charts that show schools by pyramid within the region, and then the different programs that are within those buildings. And so what I'm hearing is sort of how and where these trailers are utilized to support these programs, and kind of a better representation versus looking at multiple documents to do that.
Right, because this is one where, and I know we had a conversation often of where programming impacts our capacity needs or changes. So if there's I know it's not an easy way to do it.
And so we've provided that different heat map in the CIP, and with some notes on that. But again, you still have to look at multiple documents. So just see if we can figure out a way to have a better representation. We can take a look at that.
Thank you. And then, so, yeah, my other one, is that okay to add vestibules
So
to?
Mrs. Schultz asked about that going into the CIP, and so some of these changes that we see as next steps may show up in the CIP versus being brought back as a separate item.
And remind me, the CIP draft comes out in January generally?
December.
Oh, so it will be in December.
Yeah, we're working on it.
No, you're amazing.
You're adding to it, but we're working on it.
They are working around the clock.
Yes, so I just don't want to slow you down. Hopefully, there's a way we can represent that as well. Okay, thank you.
Okay, 144, Ms. Keys Kamara.
I think that's the gist of, the question was, how do we determine our priorities?
Is it 144?
Oh, okay. What are the best practices? Yeah. Can you identify the best practices we should consider in the use of our space? I guess that covers it, I guess. I'm sorry, I'm speaking out loud. I'm thinking out loud. Forgive me.
Okay. That seems to be pretty broad.
No, Marty was explaining. You can go ahead.
No, and so I think there's an opportunity for us with Ms. Haruda at the table to look at a bit of a study on instructional space and how principals utilize that instructional space, so that we can identify some best practices and how that space is used.
You mentioned something about flexibility of space.
Yeah.
Like, can it be flexed, into other things?
And so I think for us, it's trying to figure out where we are with that. I know that Ms. Gillis goes out and is able to go into schools to see what that space is, but I think that as a system, it would be good to us to get a sense of how our principals are using their space, if there's a need for those types of flexible spaces, so that we could then identify some best practices around how principals could better utilize and be more efficient with the space in their buildings.
One second. So I appreciate that. I know, I just want to make sure they understand what I'm looking for, and then I know she can add her wisdom to this. Because that was the gist of what I was talking about. I think in response to me saying we've had people come and testify at our board meetings, as well as spoken to people in the community about the use of space that we might consider flexible. And that's when your response was, we may want to develop what the best practices are. So I'm looking for not only the best practices, but ways to provide flexible space where we determine it's necessary. It may not be necessary in every school, although there are people asking for just places for kids to be quiet. I mean, there's, you know what I mean? There's institutional noise there, you know, and some kids may need that. So if we can just look at that issue, and forgive me, Eileen, we're still figuring out how to write this. I think she wants to say
When you first
something.
started, you mentioned the mental health aspect, and whether it was for religious reasons or just a calming place or a quiet place. And that's where, while we started answering in regards to building spaces, I think the conversation went into how can we provide best practices and how to be even flexible with the space that we already have and make recommendations to principals.
Right. I think that if you want to help me put that in a sentence, that would be the wisdom I was looking for.
Oh, okay. So,
I thought you were a lawyer, Ms. Karen Giscamara.
the best practices we should consider in use of instructional space. So what are the best practices, and in parentheses, to provide
Flexible alternatives to,
space
okay.
for
The
mental
flexible
health,
use of space.
religion, religious observance,
You want
mindfulness,
just flexible, or do you want efficient?
social, emotional relief.
Efficient is a different issue. Flexible is people having the choice of how they use that space.
To support the
depending on
social emotional needs of
To
students.
support, there you go.
To
I
support
knew
the
between
social emotional needs of students.
Few of us, yes. Efficient denotes something else, I think, Ms. Schultz, in the sense, I hope that it's efficient, but my goal is to be mindful of these particular questions with respect to the mental.
I just think it all falls under efficiency, because if there's something that could be used for a different use during the day, that flexible
but
is efficient.
I don't want, here's what I'm afraid of. I don't want administrators or anyone looking at this space and saying the emotional needs of a student is not an efficient use of this space.
Well,
And I think that can happen.
And I could say that sometimes when we're looking at the pulling back our art space or our music space, that might be in more toward a more efficient use. And so I think not necessarily everything driven by the efficiency, but I see where you're going. We just don't want to be pigeonholed, I think, for our principals.
We are only seeking input from the staff on this question. We're not making decisions. So is that, you understand what the Ms.
Yes, we understand.
Giscamara is looking for?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And I just want to weigh in, I mean, it's not captured there between 147 and 148 was the exact question I asked and made a point of making to Mr. Smith is we need to have what is the best practices for standardized use of instructional space, because right now it's done principal by principal. So
Yes,
I want that no matter what.
We do. I think they're going to give us the best practices, at least that's what my understanding.
Well,
Okay.
but also, Mr. Smith, to make sure, it's not just give us best practices. I want to know from the superintendent, what's the recommendation of, does he want to still allow a customized, every 200 schools gets to do what they want? Or is there going to be a plan to have more standardization across the system?
Okay, are you done with the 144, Ms.
Yes, I
Giscamara?
believe so.
Okay.
And then the second, 145, had to do with just how do we determine the priorities with respect to reducing the number of trailers, I believe is perhaps a clearer way to say it. And just for understanding's sake, I think the community may want to understand how we're making those decisions, if that's okay with everybody. All right, and then 146, and there's your best practice pulled completely out, Megan, so I think that addresses your concern.
So are you okay with 146?
Right, I
Okay.
mean,
have dialogue with the superintendent on what direction to then operationally do.
Ms. Kiskamara, this is your language, so you craft yours.
Right, I agree with everything other than the timing, perfect. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right, 147 is Mr. Schultz and Corbett Sanders. We talked about that. We got 148. Is this Mrs. McLachlan?
Yeah, 148.
Okay, 149.
No, 149 isn't what I said. I'm proposing that the board discuss the creation of a working group.
SAC.
What's that?
Working group.
Yes, a SAC working group. To review the existing MOU, the existing use of SAC rooms during the school day, and potential recommendations to reduce trailer usage and reduce SAC waitlist.
Well, actually, just to clarify, the last count I did, it was 245 trailers, and I forget how many SAC. So the problem would be you would want more SAC in trailers so that the brick and mortar can be used during the day. I mean, I'm hoping that that's the efficiency, because if you have children in a trailer during the day and a SAC classroom is a brick and mortar classroom inside the building, during the day that's blocked off, now you have kids outside in a trailer during the educational day.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, Ms. Schultz, I think we're in complete agreement of how do we just do this a whole lot better than what we're doing right now. And yours is a component. I almost wanted this to be very holistic review of what are we doing.
So, Mrs. McLachlan, does the language up there satisfy you? I mean, that's your language, so.
I mean, go ahead, Ms. Schultz, if you
Well,
can.
I think that
fine-tune it.
staff should come back to us. I don't want the board to keep discussing it. I think the staff should do the review of the MOU and come back to us and discuss how we can affect this.
So I think, Ms. Schultz, maybe the hybrid would be is that I would like staff to review the existing MOU, bring recommendations on perhaps improvements to the MOU to address this, and then the board can then discuss future work with the board of supervisors.
Renegotiating it with the board of
Yes.
supervisors, because it's been since like the 70s.
Yes.
So, Mrs. McLachlan, could you provide a sentence for Madam Clerk to
Our
type?
Madam Clerk, I think, is typing up right now. Yeah, so staff to review existing MOU. Yeah, so you can cut out all that in between. Staff to review existing MOU. The SAC MOU. Review existing SAC MOU. Yeah.
Review existing SAC MOU?
Yeah.
She can't hear you.
Oh.
She didn't hear that you couldn't hear her. I could hear you.
Okay.
So she's saying, speak up. So staff to review existing SAC MOU, bring recommendations to the board.
Yep. To reduce
trailer usage and SAC wait list. And potential recommendation for a SAC working group
Yep.
with the Board of Supervisors to
Yep.
renegotiate the MOU.
Creation of the SAC working group.
Okay, so Mrs. McLachlan, just read carefully one more time from the top so that we can move on to Mr. Wilson.
That's fine. It says review twice. It just needs at the very front to take that out.
Okay, all right, with that, that's done. Mr. Wilson.
No, there's nothing there about the Board of Supervisors. Potential creation of a SAC working group with the Board of Supervisors. And then
Okay.
there's that middle statement, after you say the creation of a SAC working group, you can delete existing use of SAC rooms during the school day. So there you go. Creation of working group and potential recommendations. No.
No, a creation of a SAC, and the potential creation of a SAC working group with the Board of Supervisors to renegotiate the MOU.
No.
Okay. I'm not going to comment on the comma, but Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. So there were two things. One is I'd like staff to review and present alternatives to expedite the vestibule renovations that are currently planned as part of the standard renovation schedule, and perhaps even if we can't do the same changes that we're making in the context of a full renovation, maybe there's an alternative that can be done to improve security. So that's the first one, to staff to review and present an
Okay.
alternative to expedite vestibule renovation.
Could you go slowly so that she can type that?
Okay.
It's
Yep, that's right. She got it. Despite
Okay.
my
So what's
despite
the
my
next
speed.
one?
I appreciate you reminding me to talk slower, though. And then the second one is for perhaps Mr. Vaccarello will do this in closed, but I think that I would like to know, how do we ensure the integrity of the security procedures that are being implemented, in particularly at elementary schools, to ensure that they are consistent across our schools, and that may be a system of testing or something like that. Yeah, we got to have fidelity in that
Okay. So,
implementation.
Mr. Wilson, could you give us a sentence?
I'm reading it right now, Mr. Moon. It really should start with staff to present, yeah.
Step to present.
How FCPS ensures integrity of security measures being implemented especially at elementary schools.
Especially in elementary schools.
Yep.
Okay. With that, Mr. Schwartz.
I had on mine, on the cost per pupil that we have, we really should be showing a cost per pupil for different students, elementary, middle,
Elementary,
high
middle, and
school,
high.
and alternative. That should, and then I had SAC on there, but we got the SAC. So show cost per pupil disaggregated by elementary, middle, high school, alternative. But
I think that is in the program budget book, isn't it?
It is in the adopted budget book, but it's cost per service, and it appears on page 386.
But we don't show it in this goal report. We just roll it up to within the WABE. And I don't know what everybody else is doing, but I think it's better for us to be transparent in each of our documents. And I don't know, I think maybe Mr. Vaccarello was saying it earlier, or maybe it was Mr. Smith, the business of everybody having to go and hunt. Like, if you already know and you have it, build it into the same report, or at least build in a link that shows, because everybody sees like one rolled up number. And the reality is that a general education elementary student does not cost what a special education student in an alternative setting does. I mean, I understand that there's a cost per service, but I think that we have a duty to have a greater degree of clarity of what the education costs are in each of our documents.
Yeah, the previous report did include the additional information. The only problem is with having those as metrics is the other divisions don't calculate that, so we don't have any benchmarks, but we can still provide the data.
I'm just asking for, since we know that when we have a report like this, that we could say, while we're staying within $1,000 of the WABE, that's the overall cost for student. The disaggregated costs for students can be found here, and you can just link it. Or what we're doing is we're putting information into people's hands in a more user-friendly manner.
So does that capture what you wanted, Mr. Schultz?
In the goal report, or a link as may be, or a link.
So I'm just chiming in here. I want that in the report. It can be as an appendix, however you want to do it. But if not, I will bring it forward as an amendment before I'm willing to vote on this report, because I really do think it's important that it's a goal report, it's an annual report, and one of the frustrations that the public and the board members, individual board members, I won't speak for the full board, is we don't put information all in one place, and so it's out of context.
Okay, that's 152. Let me add just one more thing, 153. Madam Chair, I think we may want to schedule a work session sometime, just basically generally to talk about what the board is expecting to see, want to see in all of these reports, because we seem to be having 30, 40 additional requests every time we get presentation from the staff on these goals reports. If we have those discussions in advance of what we are expecting, we probably do not have to have a 30, 40. So, hopefully schedule some time, after with a new board coming in, because new board members might want to see different things too, so that they know what to do. Okay. Yes. Okay, thank you. With that, this meeting is adjourned.